If there's one thing that the CIA, the State Department, and the U.S. Institute of Peace all have in common, and that's U.S. aid. U.S. aid was the great front for 60 years for this whole network. U.S. aid was shut down, actually not primarily for its bad behavior, but because it refused to turn over documents. It was really the only agency in the federal government that just straight up refused to allow the new administration. It's a U.S. government agency under the executive branch, and it just refused to give the executive branch the documents, the emails, any of that. This concept I've been describing of a so-called professional class of regime change specialists at USAID, the State Department, and the CIA, and this language that I've been using for years now, which is that we have trained this professional class of government officials at USAID, the State Department, and the CIA with a very special set of skills, which is toppling governments that the U.S. State Department does not like, that the foreign policy establishment, U.S., UK, NATO, our transatlantic alliance, when we need a government gone, we have a professional class of specialists we employ to do that work. And they're concentrated at USAID, the State Department, the Central Intelligence Agency, and all of the USAID and State Department funded NGOs and foundations and for-profit contractors of that network. And this is fundamentally what this group has been doing to and against Trump, taking that special set of skills to deploy U.S. government-funded NGOs against the democratically elected president. This is the group that we send in to topple a democracy. This is how we get trust back, by saying this is not how we do business anymore. And I believe that's also going to lead to levels of accountability with how to reform these institutions once the network set is fully laid out. And on that note, I have to mention that the U.S. aid files are absolutely key to this. If there's one thing that the CIA, the State Department, and the U.S. Institute of Peace all have in common, and that's U.S. aid. U.S. aid was the great front for 60 years for this whole network. And U.S. aid formally shut down on July 1st. That's almost 2 months ago now. It's been absorbed by the F branch of the State Department, the Foreign Assistance branch of the State Department. So they are now administering the legacy grants. It's about 30%-ish of the USAID function. There have been 14,000 people who were laid off at USAID, and it's being administered by a much smaller crew of people. But we need to see the USAID files, the internal analyst memos, the white papers, the emails, the text messages, everything from USAID employee to USAID employee or USAID employee to NGO or contractor has to be made public. And I can give you some great examples of why this is such a necessity. But the present blocking point, as I understand it, is that the State Department does not presently even have access to the USAID files because of the IT blockages. That is, USAID people, I believe, simply didn't turn over the encryption or the passwords or the like. So we're sitting on the Library of Alexandria of historical knowledge of what the Biden administration and the blob have been doing, and nobody's even opened the door yet. I find that shocking.
I want to sort of piece this together, right, which is the deep state, the permanent political class, the in-your-face state, however you want to couch it. Frankly, in this paradigm, I think maybe just likening it more to the kind of ossified career civil servant mentality in a lot of these departments or agencies, institutions, take your pick, but how they cover up the actions of a lot of these very rogue politicals. So my question is, why haven't these USAID files that you were talking about, why haven't they been released? What is the holdup there?
Well, my understanding is that it's a technical issue that, when you're talking about documents that are stored in a digitized way, there's encryption, there's passwords, there's access codes. And remember, USAID fought tooth and nail to the very last courtroom they could humanly litigate in order to stave off the Trump administration. USAID was shut down, actually not primarily for its bad behavior, but because it refused to turn over documents. It was really the only agency in the federal government that just straight up refused to allow the new administration. It's a U.S. government agency under the executive branch, and it just refused to give the executive branch the documents, the emails, any of that. And while we still have, the State Department is still administering the grants, all of the legacy information, for example, the USAID has a country office in every country, whether it's in Africa, whether it's in Europe, whether it's in Asia, or whether it's in Central or South America. Every country has a mission. There's email traffic and files and analyst papers and classified documents in all of those countries. There's also the bureaus within USAID. For example, probably the worst of them was the bureau called DRG within USAID. That's Democracy, Rights, and Governance. That was for the democracy promotion, the regime change, and paying the media, and paying the unions, and paying the NGOs, and governance, which is effectively when USAID has programs to take control over elements of your government. And the DRG branch of USAID is who ran the censorship syndicate that was funded to the tune of billions of dollars over the past 8 years by USAID. All of the traffic between the NGOs and USAID, because every grant recipient from USAID had to file reports, had to file annual reports, had to do quarterly updates, had to correspond with their grant administrator about how they were fulfilling their milestones. Most of these grants are for absolutely atrocious things, and nothing that USAID did was honest. It's always dual purpose. It's always some nominal thing that it says it does, and then some CIA covert sub-purpose. That's the only reason to run it through USAID as opposed to the State Department. But you can't understand the history of these countries and what you're inheriting at the State Department unless you have the USAID side of the story. But the real guts of this are ultimately going to lie in the USAID communications themselves. Donald Trump and Secretary Rubio are locked in horns right now with the country of Brazil. Brazil has gone full China. They've divested from many American contracts and given China control over their agriculture, their energy, their IT. There's currently sanctions on Brazil's chief justice of their election court, and Brazil is now trying to defy those sanctions by ordering their banks not to honor the American sanctions policy, which, if that goes through, could upend hundreds of different sanctions regimes that the U.S. has in place. And the State Department does not even understand what they've inherited because they don't have the USAID side of the story. The USAID mission in Brazil, all those files from the past 8 years have to be made available, have to be made public. They at least have to be reviewed by the State Department. But we have more transparency into the CIA than we do USAID. In theory, Tulsi can ask for and declassify any CIA document. But neither Tulsi at ODNI nor the State Department can even get into the USAID files. They need an IT expert in there immediately to decrypt this and make it public.
Where do you sort of, maybe in your mind, kind of reverse engineer? Obviously, we don't know the answer, but place the blame, perhaps it's a loaded word, but sort of the issue with the release of these files. Is this something that, is it the Trump admin? Is it politicals? Is it something that, what we would colloquially refer to as the deep state? Is it a CIA thing? Where do you think that sort of urge to suppress this is really emanating from?
I think it's a combination of donors and national security officials. I think that they have intersecting interests on this, and they're both involved in the story, and they both have considerable influence on not just the White House itself, but the agencies, the policies at all the executive branch agencies. I think that part of the reason this is such a hot potato is because there are Trump world donors who have been intimately involved in this network, and part of the reason this is such a hot potato is because if they have to tell us about Epstein's ties, then they have to tell the world, because the world reads our media. They can't just give us all all 300 million Americans national security clearances to access it. It becomes public knowledge, which means the entire network effectively would have its cover blown, and it would frankly generate a lot more questions than answers about every single thing. Once Epstein's intelligence ties are confirmed, then what that immediately proceeds to is a intense forensic, detailed, microscopic investigation into every single thing that Epstein has done, everyone that he's handled money for, every company he's invested in, every region he did business in, every business leader he met with, in order to effectively ask, okay, well, was that a CIA operation? Was that Israeli intelligence, Saudi intelligence, UK intelligence? What every single thing of a storied 4-decade international jet-setting career then gets opened up and infected by the intelligence label once Epstein does. And so I think that, in combination with donor pressure, has been has created a real bind that has put the White House squarely in the crosshairs of the power struggle between the voting base and the donors who provide the money